Well, welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Government Resilience, Extreme Weather. This webinar has been organised as part of our work for our environmental impact assessment community, following on from past events on climate resilience and extreme weather which we've held. I will post a link in the chat shortly once the presentation gets going with more information on that community if you're interested in that. We are delighted today to be joined by two speakers from the National Audit Office, Sian Jones, Director of Cross-Government Value for Money, and Katie Loss, Head of Environment and Climate Change. A massive thank you to them both for taking the time to join us today. As always, there will be a chance for questions at the end of their presentation, so please do submit these, and you can do that in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. You can submit questions at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you all for logging in. It's great to see so many of you here today. I'll hand over to Sian and Katie. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ethne. We're delighted to be joining you today to talk a bit both about our recent report on government resilience, extreme weather, and our wider work on climate and the environment. So I'm going to kick off and talk to you specifically about the extreme weather report, and I'll hand on to my colleague Katie, who will run through that programme of work that we have ongoing, both in the past and what's coming up in the future. So we're going to cover off, why audit government resilience, sort of the key question really, and then looking at UK government resilience and its framework, back, the key findings of the report and the recommendations, and then, as I say, Katie's work looking at the wider environment and climate change. So I guess sort of number one question, why audit government resilience? Well, I guess for a number of reasons. So for those of you that don't know the National Audit Office, we're known as the sort of government spending watchdog, which means that we do two key things, really. We audit government accounts, so following the money, looking at whether sort of everything in the accounts is right, true and fair. And on our side of the house, if you like, we also look at what we call the value for money of government spending. And that could be in a number of different ways. It could be like in the report I'm going to talk to you today, where we look at a major programme, project or effort or policy that government undertakes and look at how then they are delivering that. Or as with Katie's work, we could do that from a more insight-based perspective where we're drawing together lessons, good practice, or trying to kind of assess where we might support and help government departments and other bodies to improve, and I guess add our voice to the sort of the debate on very key issues that are occurring. So some reports there that span some of the history or the recent history, if you like, on where we got to and why we did this report. So we did a series of reports on the COVID-19 pandemic, and one of the sort of, I suppose, reports that collated some of the insights was the lessons for government on risk management. So we took, I think, our first 10 COVID reports and looked across sort of thematically to understand kind of what worked well and what needed to be improved. And I guess one of the really key findings from that was that the government's end-to-end risk management process and its national resilience plans did need some more focus, because clearly, COVID-19 did throw into sharp effect the impact that, I suppose, various crises and different dimensions that COVID caused that hit an already sort of at sometimes crumbling infrastructure, both sort of physical and actual. The UK Government Resilience Framework, I'm sure you're all familiar with that. So that's where the UK government a couple of years ago set out its strategic approach to strengthening resilience. And I think by 2025 or 2030, so they set out a number of actions as to what they needed to achieve. And then that sort of was followed up by the National Risk Register. So that's the public-facing version. And of those 89 risks, sort of 8 were extreme weather risks, which probably gives you a sort of sense as to why we decided to look at extreme weather as part of some of our first reports on resilience. And that brings us up to last December, when we reported on government resilience, extreme weather. So what we did there was pick 4 risks related to extreme weather. So storms, heat waves, surface water, and what was the last one? Droughts. Testing my recent memory there. So we looked at 4 of those risks and basically use those as a lens through which to look at the system. And the reason why we sort of stepped back and took a system-based approach was because my portfolio of work is really interested in not just looking at sort of departmental-led responses, but looking across the piece to see how the bits in between, if you like, departments, the bits in between the systems work, how they connect, or how they can be improved. So we took that perspective when we looked at this report. So just digging in to the report. So that, I suppose that diagram gives you a bit of context as to how the UK government's approach to resilience is structured. Again, I don't need to tell you sort of the complexity and the sort of interconnectedness of the whole system. So you've got everything there from the Cabinet Office, who obviously is responsible for the National Risk Register and the assessment. And they also lead on overall response to sort of acute emergencies, as well as leading sort of professionalisation in emergency management. They then delegate the leads of each of those risks, and indeed all the risks on the risk register, to what they call lead government departments, and then other departments and arm's length bodies that clearly support those departments. And then you've got sort of going across to the right, all the local responders, you know, that do all the important work on the ground to respond in an emergency, as well as, you know, really trusted advisors like the National Infrastructure Commission, the Climate Change Committee. And then at the bottom there, you have the private sector. So we're talking there about the potential for regulatory requirements and how that might support and leverage beneficial change, as well as obviously private companies, and where government often looks for them to, for instance, match funding when you're talking about various different environmental projects. So you can see there, I'm not going to read that out, the sort of definition of resilience. I think we all understand that, the ability to recover and to be more robust to risks. So it is the ability to anticipate as well as to sort of respond and recover. And I've already talked about the sort of wide range of stakeholders that are involved. So I'm going to dig in now a few slides just on the key findings. So this was a really big report that covered quite a lot of ground. So I'm not going to do it justice in 15 minutes. So I'm going to give you a quick canter through the key points, but I'd be very happy to have a conversation outside this presentation, or, you know, the report is very easily findable on the website if you'd like to dig in and have a look. So we looked at, I suppose, three key areas. We looked at government's approach to managing risk overall, and then their ability to sort of identify and understand extreme weather events, and then I guess how they sort of respond to that. So I guess the chain goes from arrangements, so what's on paper and what does that look like, identifying and understanding what's the intelligence and the data and the insight level like, and then the third point, how are they using both the systems and the data in order to be able to prepare and respond. So I guess sort of on the sort of positive side, since 2021, government and Cabinet Office have been doing loads of work to strengthen how they approach national risks. I mentioned the National Risk Assessment and the publishing the risk register. They've also done some structural things internally. So they've got a National Situation Centre. The Cabinet Office has tried to sort of delineate a bit more explicitly the difference between responding to acute risks and that kind of response side, the sort of COBRA side, and the Resilience Directorate side, where they're being sort of more reflective and thinking more longer term about how we shore up our defences, and whether that be to extreme risk or obviously some of the other risks that sit on the register. However, you know, all really good positive improvements, but some roles and responsibilities for managing risks are still not clear. I mean, the diagram on the previous slide shows that it's necessarily complicated given the agencies and the bodies involved. But we're talking here, for instance, about sort of different lead government departments being responsible for different stages of managing risk. So, you know, one might be managing the sort of response, one might be managing the kind of overall preparation for it. And I think the relationship between lead government departments and local bodies and Cabinet Office, whilst better enunciated, still I think needs a bit more clarity in order to sort of get those relationships working properly, both in a kind of reflective sense and an emergency sense. So going on from that, so we talk about whole system risks, and I explain sort of why we are focusing at that level of risk rather than looking explicitly just at government departments. So the government is increasingly thinking about sort of the whole system. So they're thinking about how risks are dealt with from top to bottom, from left to right, if you like, and bottom up. But the lead government department approach, as I mentioned there, is still quite challenging. So essentially what we're asking there is for government departments to act as a convener, as a collaborator, and try to get other government departments on board. That's really quite difficult, given their sort of resources and their skill sets in that area. So this is about sort of coordinating and having that ability to coordinate action across the piece, which we found in numerous dimensions to be really difficult, right, for government departments to do, to work across departments in order to achieve that common goal. Something the Climate Change Committee has also noted in terms of being able to make progress on climate adaptation in particular, where DEFRA lead. So I guess in response to those challenges, Government and Cabinet Office are trying to think about how they oversee a more strategic perspective on risk and what the role for Cabinet Office is in that. The last point here, and again, I'm not going to do this point justice in the time that we have. This is a sort of, this is an interesting, I guess, finding for us, and a really knotty point to try and work through in practice. So we're talking there about how resilient a government would like the UK to be. So I guess in practice, what we mean is, how does government want a response to risk to look, given that there's a finite pot of money and they can't you can't spend 100% of money on everything in order to bring everything up to a gold standard. So that being said, how does that sort of resilience look? What is your risk appetite in various risks? And here, obviously, we applied it to extreme weather, but equally could be anything. What does that look like? And then if we know what that looks like, we can start to think about, does our appetite match the level of funding that we are prioritising for that? And if that is not the case, how do we calibrate that? More trickily, what do we spend less on, or what do we target less, in order to be able to spread that finite pot more widely? And I guess from that, and I won't get into the recommendations because we have a slide on that later, to us that felt like a good journey towards working out what you should spend and when. So for instance, talk about sort of surface water flooding, much more difficult to predict. The Met Office is doing some really good work trying to build up its capacity and capability of that. Obviously very localized, very difficult to predict. You know, we're much better as a country on predicting things that are easier to predict. No sort of surprise there. But equally, how are we going to get to a point where we understand what we're prepared to accept on a risk basis? And that's a really difficult question, and one that we've posed, and I'll get to the recommendations and talk about how we've I suppose posed that to the Cabinet Office. So a few more key findings here. So I think I'll actually pick the second one first, because it leads on from what I was talking about there. So essentially, this idea of this journey towards understanding what I'm prepared to accept in terms of my risk appetite and my tolerance. How do I work towards that in terms of sort of fiscal and I suppose other policy areas? So government recognises that. So in the resilience strategy, they committed to developing an approach to investment, basically trying to cost their overall investment in resilience. That's not going to be ready till 2030. So again, we have asked them to bring that forward, because we think understanding the size of the pot is again another step towards understanding what you've got to spend and how you target it. And the two other points there, clearly regulation and standards are really key. So on regulation side, there's a mixed bag in terms of sort of regulatory involvement and adherence to standards and action on extreme weather. And I guess from our perspective, we were thinking about who are the actors that can actually leverage beneficial change. So we've sort of called that out in terms of regulation and standards being really good tools for government to use, that they could improve on. And again, you know, in the line of who else can come on board to help us to tackle this really difficult, knotty issue. Where's the private sector investment? So we did a report on flood resilience that was closely tied to this, and, you know, match funding, where we're doing 50-50 from government and private sector in order to fund projects, is still not where it should be. So I'm going to quickly run through these recommendations and then pass over to Katie. So thinking about kind of this whole system approach and the role Cabinet Office has, the role government departments have, what does risk look like and what does a resilient UK look like? We try to sort of logically lay out the recommendations in that way, so that there was a sort of a bit of a, every time I click the screen it moves, sorry. So there was a sort of bit of narrative flow to it. So, you know, at the start, we're really keenly talking about these accountability and assurance arrangements. So when the report went to the Public Accounts Committee, which is sort of the accountability chain and process that any reports go through, the committee sort of went one step further and started talking about the role, for instance, of a chief risk advisor as one way of cementing accountability and lead arrangements. Again, we talked about the system-wide oversight, really keen to sort of plug the gaps in that to make sure that we've got a robust end-to-end system. I talked about what a resilient UK looks like and the roles of sort of the private and voluntary sector. The standards and regulator involvement, we've called for more involvement for those in order to support lead government departments and Cabinet Office. Again, this approach to investment, bring it forward to 2025 and implement it by 2028, because we feel that's going to give them the ability to then think about how much they've got to spend and how they can spend it more wisely. And lastly, again, back to this private sector point, you know, how are departments and Treasury and Cabinet Office positioned to have this capacity and capability to really leverage that greater investment in climate adaptation from the private sector. And quickly before I pass on to Katie, I just wanted to sort of mention the where this report went to after it published. I mentioned the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, who are essentially a super select committee, if you like, because they are the only committee that look across at value for money. They don't focus on a particular department, a particular topic. They generally base their sessions on NEO reports. We publish around 60 a year. So, and they meet twice a week when Parliament's in session. So they then hold to account the accounting officers of the departments and agencies that are responsible for that policy. So we had a session on this a couple of months ago. The committee, as you would imagine, are really interested in both risk resilience and extreme weather. Had a really good discussion, so that those both the meeting and the notes of the meeting are available online on Parliament TV if you wanted to have a look at it. Essentially, the committee were very interested in thinking about how government applies learning from previous extreme weather events and how they can think sensibly and logically about targeting spend in order to, I suppose this is the best to save, you know, invest a penny, save a pound point. So that was a really interesting discussion. And we await then Cabinet Office and departments' response to the Public Accounts Committee report, where they have to sort of publish in what we call a Treasury Minute, their response to government's recommendations. So still very much an active and live thing, as is our work on resilience more generally. So happy to take any questions on that when we get to Q&A. But with that, I will pass over to Katie so she can talk to you about our wider work on climate change and environment.
Thanks, Sharon. So I'll just draw this to a close with an overview, really. I thought it'd be interesting for this audience to give an overview of the work that we've done more broadly on environment and climate change. And I'll also pick up a couple of reports that we've done or coming up that you might be particularly interested to know about. So we actually have quite a broad, a wide back catalogue of work on environment and climate change now. In 2020, we effectively started something of a new phase of our work in this area with two what we called landscape reports, so very broad reports looking at government's approach to achieving the net zero target and also its wider environmental goals, and looking at how government was set up to achieve those goals as a whole. And also some of the key risks and issues that we thought it would be sensible for it to, you know, the risks and issues that we thought government would need to focus on. Since then, we've done deeper dives into different aspects of government's work. So that's covered both the delivery of particular projects or schemes. So, for example, the rollout of smart meters or the environmental land management scheme, those examples at the bottom there. We've also looked at the delivery of a policy objective as a whole. So decarbonising the power sector, for example, or government's work to tackle local breaches of air quality. We've looked at approaches to a cross-cutting issue like environmental taxes. And then we've also looked at individual organisations, individual bits of government, and how they fulfil their environmental remit, with the most recent one being on Department for Education, a sustainability overview of the Department for Education. So from this work, I mean, all these reports are available on our website, and again, like Sean, I'm very happy to talk about any, pick up separately if there are any particular ones of interest. I guess just to flag one that you might be particularly interested in, that in a way links to the extreme weather study, the climate change risk good practice guide that's at the bottom of this slide here, and which I'll put a link to in the chat afterwards. It might be quite interesting. I think that it's a good practice guide that's designed for audit, risk and assurance committees to allow them to hold management to account on how does the organisation understand its climate risks, how does it manage those climate risks within the organisation. So I think for anybody, that there's quite a nice set of questions in there that if you're interested in how the organisations that you work for understand climate risk and deal with it, that can be might be of interest. I think the other two studies that I just mentioned that are coming up, we're doing a study on biodiversity net gain. So as I'm sure you will know, the statutory requirement for construction developments and redevelopments to have a measurably positive impact on biodiversity, really important change to the way the planning system works. We are looking at that. We're examining the progress that DEFRA and Natural England have made in implementing statutory biodiversity net gain, and we're also looking at how are they doing that in a way that both maximises the benefits and manages the risks on an ongoing basis. The other one that I would mention is a lessons learned study that we're doing, which will draw together the common issues and challenges that we find across this body of work, and really draw that together to see actually what do we think the lessons are for government for the next phase of its work on environment and climate change. Where do we see common challenges? For example, as Sean was talking about, coordinating across government on these issues is often an issue that we come across with any aspect of government's work in this area, unsurprisingly, given these are very big, long-term, broad challenges that government is trying to achieve. Stakeholder and public engagement, for example, is another issue that we can come up against. And similarly, again, as was raised in extreme weather, it's having a very clear sense of where government is trying to get to. The clarity of objectives has come up in other studies as well. So we want to really draw out, what are the key things that we think government needs to focus on for the next phase of its work. And if you think, there are particular topics that you think we should be covering within that, or particular people or reports that we should be drawing on, please do let us know. So I think with that, I'll probably draw it to a close and go back for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Sean and Katie. That was a really interesting overview of the work of the NAO in this area with the focus on extreme weather and environment. So thank you so much for that. And I'd encourage all of our attendees to put their questions in the Q&A function. Just to kick off, we'll go straight into it in the interest of time. Thanks so much. So both of you mentioned a few times the kind of whole system approach that NAO are taking in this space, which is really welcome from an IES perspective. Systems thinking and a systems approach is so important in the environment. I wonder if there have been many discussions or kind of a focus on the role of resilience measures that can be implemented that have multifunctional benefits. So it's thinking about resilience in terms of extreme weather, but also where they can have other environmental benefits like biodiversity or social benefits as well. I wonder if there's been kind of even broadening out the system a little bit further.
I mean, fantastic question. I'm going to ask Katie to come in. This seems to be in her.
Yes, absolutely. It's a great question, and it's so important. And I mean, it arguably could be one of these issues that we draw out as a kind of, we phrased it in terms of understanding the trade-offs and the synergies, which I think is basically the same point, isn't it? And actually how that being really fundamental to how government is successful in these areas. I mean, the way that it's come up in our reports before, we certainly have been part of encouraging government to do that and to think very carefully about that. And actually, so for example, in those broader landscape reports that we raised at the beginning, actually, how does government, practically speaking, do that? How does it bake it into the way that it thinks about these things? And does do that in a way that actually gets to the nuts and bolts of where you can have the most effect, with rather than it feeling like you're just trying to do everything all at once. I think there has to be some way of actually getting to the nub of it. But yes, it's something that does come up, and I can see it being a more important feature of our work as we go forward.
It's really useful, thank you. I agree, a very challenging area, but an important one. An attendee question here is asked, do we really understand the risks of extreme heat and how this has changed faster than expected, given some of the record-breaking global temperatures we've seen over the past few years? And I might just add on to that question a little bit, given the uncertainty around certain risks, how do you think the government can build in kind of flexibility in their resilience measures so that they are effective in kind of uncertain future environments?
Should I start there, Katie, just from the sort of resilience perspective, and you can come in on the climate change side? I mean, really, really difficult areas to tackle for government, right? I mean, I guess I can say in our report, what was really interesting were the knock-on effects from extreme heat. So this idea that, you know, I was just looking at my notes here to kind of just make sure I was getting it right, but by 2050, hot summers in the UK are projected to double in frequency. And I think, you know, the knock-on effects for that, and we note a few in our report, were really, I think, powerful. So I think we quoted a example where servers in a hospital trust went down as a result of the extreme temperatures, and then, you know, that shut down systems, which obviously, you know, appointments, everything else. So I don't think we are. Our report says that we are not as prepared as we could be, whilst acknowledging, I think, there's this idea of government is improving, but are we improving at the pace that we need to keep track of the kind of how quickly extreme heat is becoming a real problem? And I guess things that we don't talk about in the report, but I'm sure that the one of your sort of the attendees who sent in the question is thinking about, you know, tracks buckling, roads, you know, not being able to be driven on. So we don't specifically go into all the different effects of that, but what really struck me as part of doing this report is that idea of how is government going to keep pace with the huge amounts of knock-on effects of heat and you know, vulnerable communities, and what do we do and that side of things. But Katie, did you want to come in particularly on the extreme heat side?
I don't have anything to particularly add beyond that, just to, I guess, emphasize that understanding that risk appetite is really critical, isn't it, for government, and a really difficult question about that when you're investing for resilience. How what level of insurance are you looking at, and are we in potentially uncharted territory as temperatures rise? But yeah, so
great, thank you. And from both of your experience working in this area, I wonder, do you think getting people together to work on whole systems resilience is the biggest challenge, or is it actually the lack of climate finance and budgets for climate change adaptation?
I mean, I'm going to start off and be a typical auditor on that and say it's probably both. I would say that I have, again, I'll come to Katie in a second, from the sort of the climate change finance and environmental perspective. But clearly in our report, it was very obvious that by being able to develop that whole system approach was probably the most efficient way, the most efficient, effective way of getting to where we need to be. You know, notwithstanding the fact it's really difficult, but also it's clear again that there is a finite pot, and how is that pot going to be used to its best ability, which is why we sort of talk quite a lot in the report about understanding how much is spent, not because, you know, we're auditors and we think that there should be a number, but because we can use that then in order to be cleverer and smarter about how we spend our money. So I think it is both. But I don't know, Katie, do you want to talk a bit about sort of financing for climate change and adaptation?
Yes, I think I would agree that it's both. I guess one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about more broadly, and it does come up in the extreme weather study, is about, you know, what as and when you have this clear sense of where you need to get to, how does government develop a pathway to getting there, that make sure you do things in the right order and in the right in a sensible sequence, and that you bring people together and that people know where they're going. And I think that to me is part of the picture of how do you then understand who needs to work together and who and what finance do you need and where is it going to come from. But that is a particularly interesting and difficult thing to do when you're talking about such long-term timescales and such complex changes. That again, I think, and again, if people have particular thoughts on this, I think that's where the systems thinking really comes in, and it's a challenging thing for government to be doing.
Thank you. And can you confirm how responsible authorities are being audited with regard to their responsibilities on this area? For example, if they're behind with steering group setups, detailed risk analysis, etc.
Well, I suppose, from our perspective, we're auditing sort of government spend, and from that perspective, we are holding responsible authorities to account with their responsibilities. Really interesting point, though, about when you're getting into the kind of meat of it, about like setups and the governance and risk analysis. So one thing that came out of our report in terms of contingency planning was that government doesn't really test or assure contingency plans sitting at a regional and local level, because it feels like it would be overkill, essentially, not proportionate. But equally, I guess we argued that completely get that, you can't audit 100% of things 100% of the time, but equally being able to have some sense of assurance that those things are in place and that people are able to keep track or have the capacity even, to keep track and understand where those gaps might exist. So I think, I guess I would say that auditing is necessarily not 100%, maybe a bit patchy in places. So though we haven't audited that specifically across the piece, I would say there's probably room for improvement there. I would as an auditor, but.
Great, thank you. And can you talk about how, in a macro sense, the government thinks about the balance of things, focusing on infrastructure here, of letting infrastructure assets run to obsolescence, or proactive write-off and upgrade, particularly with a kind of value for money lens?
I can certainly talk about the fact that we talk about this an awful lot. So the NEO talk about this awful lot, and I can see Katie's come off mute, so I will come to her in a second. We talk an awful lot in the past about sort of what people might consider very dry, but we considered very important things about the split between capital and revenue funding when we talk about Treasury and how it gives us money out. And the reason why I think we felt that was important was because it leads directly into this investor save, spend a penny save a pound type mentality, because sometimes there's a perverse incentive to use a capital budget and not have enough maintenance. So it's the idea, right, of the attraction, and I'm using a really basic example here for speed, of building a dam versus cutting a grass verge 4 times a year to stop a flood, essentially. And I'm not saying that government is doing that, but that's a very, very basic example of the whole kind of the difference between maintenance and capital. More recently, I think we're trying to phrase that in a more resilience way. So we're trying to say that the split between funding does not give government, or government at the moment is not really staying on top of infrastructure, and that is going to cost it more in the long run. So we've done it on some school buildings, hospital buildings, we've done it on a range of roads, rail infrastructure, and alongside this idea of making sure that maintenance is upkept when it often isn't, is that idea of longer term Treasury funding allocations. So we increasingly talk about the importance of medium and longer term financial plans and financial settlements to allow these, not just departments, ALBs, local authorities to be able to say we can build in maintenance to our schedule further down the line. But there's no question that this is one of the key issues that we are focusing on across our programme. Katie, do you want to come in?
I was just going to add an example to that from the flood resilience study that accompanied the extreme weather study, which I think is a really stark example where we drew attention to the issues that government needs to really understand that split between maintenance and capital, new build. So with flood defences, so our report on the resilience to flood risk, which again is available on our website, we found there that the Environment Agency's maintenance of flood defences was not optimising value for money, because we found that when DEFRA and the Environment Agency hadn't assessed whether actually some of the underspend on its capital funding programme would be better value for money put towards maintenance, because it had was lacking some I think 34 million for maintenance funding, which meant that hundreds of thousands of properties were not as well protected as they would ideally be, and actually yet it was underspending on its capital funding programme for new flood defences. And actually those questions about where is this money spent, could this underspend be used elsewhere, was a question that we were encouraging government to be thinking about.
It's really useful. Thank you very much, both. And then kind of thinking about climate risk, maybe when businesses are thinking about it as well, is how do we avoid piecemeal adaptation and mitigation measures that may adversely affect other communities or stakeholders than their business? So do you think that responsible authorities should take the lead in enabling sharing on data and information to try and stop this kind of thing happening?
Katie, any views?
Sounds sensible to me, but I'm not sure I have a particular insight to add on that. I think that broader point about how do we do these things in a holistic way, which comes back to the first question, I think is a really interesting one. And actually governments and the various bodies that are involved, the role in actually making sure that there's a sense of what needs to happen as a whole is really important, because absolutely you can get unintended consequences along the way if you do it in a piecemeal fashion. So yeah, I would just agree with the sentiment, but I don't have anything on the specifics.
Thank you, that's really useful. And I'm not sure if this is an area you can answer as well, but I'll just throw it to you just in case, which is, how should local authorities be making the case for further funding? Those who are often kind of implementing resilience measures, assessing all the indirect costs, systems impacts, for example, is complex, as we've been discussing. So are there any kind of thoughts in that area, any guidance?
Not specifically, I don't think. From what we've looked at, we do tend to focus on central government and then how that sort of goes down to local authorities. I guess, you know, when we talk about departments and we talk about the spending review process, we talk about the kind of hygiene factors, and this isn't going to be sort of new for anyone on this call, but you know, the ability to put together the business case, costed in the right way, evidence-based, and I'm sure that's what, you know, the very professional local authorities we have are already doing. So I won't pretend I have any added insight to that, other than it's really, really hard. And I guess it is one of the things we've been trying to think about across our work, not just in this piece, is the idea of how government gets better at working across the piece, and not just with departments, but with local authorities. So they do get better bang for their buck on the money that we've got. And I think it's a continuing question, and I think sure the one that will continue into the next government, regardless of colour, but it's not one that we'd have, I think, any specific advice on. No magic bullet from us, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And then finally, there's a question here which I think is probably slightly out of the NAO's kind of area, but I'll slightly amend it to see if you have any thoughts on this area, which is from an attendee from Nigeria, who was kind of exploring the impact of oil-bearing communities and how kind of they can build resilience in affected communities from some of the environmental impacts. So slightly kind of rethinking that in terms of your areas is, as the government kind of goes through this journey of building resilience, will there be any kind of anything in place to try and support knowledge exchange with other countries who are trying to do similar things and trying to improve resilience in their own communities and countries?
I know Katie is an active player in that network. Katie, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yes, it's something that we're thinking a lot about at the moment, and I think it's really important. So yes, we often do encourage government to be looking at an international perspective, and you would have thought on environment and climate change issues, this is where the opportunity is arguably greatest, isn't it? We're all trying to do very similar things. We should all be not having to repeat the same lessons we should be, sharing internationally. So it's something we very much encourage. We're very interested in. We play our part in. So there's a network of audit offices internationally, which we're with and a working group on environmental audit, which we're very active in. So yeah, we're playing our part, but absolutely, I think it's really, really critical.
Great. Well, amazing thank you to both of you. That was really useful to hear all of your insights and really interesting to hear about the NAO's work in this area. So thank you so much for taking the time and presenting today. I think that we're just about out of time now for questions, so I'll just do a short kind of conclusion to the day. A massive thank you to all the attendees as well for coming and submitting their questions. I hope you found that as useful as I did. And if you are an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance using our IES CPD tool, which you can find by logging into the members area. As usual, the webinar has been recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel and our website. If you are watching the recording on YouTube, please do subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. Also, I just wanted to highlight an event that might be of interest, very much given the ethos of systems thinking that we've been talking about today. I'm just going to post a quick link in the chat. This is a new conference that the IES is launching this year called Dialogue Between Disciplines, a groundbreaking event dedicated to fostering collaboration and knowledge sharing between environmental professionals from across specialisms and sectors. This first conference will focus on facilitating discussions on the triple crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, very much with the aim of championing solutions and practical action. If you are interested in finding out more, I've dropped the link in the chat and you can find out all the information on our website as well. A massive thank you again to you, Sian and Katie, and everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.